The entire city of Lagos fell silent as an old street cleaner was called onto a grand stage she had spent years sweeping around but never stepping on. Her worn sandals trembled against polished marble. Then, without warning, two of the most powerful young figures in the city, one a celebrated doctor, the other a rising business tycoon, dropped to their knees before her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people began to cry. Others stood frozen, unable to understand what they were witnessing. Why would the city's brightest stars bow to a woman everyone had ignored for decades? Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to join our growing family. Lagos never slept, but it forgot people. In the crowded edges of Ajagunle, where rusted zinc roofs leaned into one another like tired shoulders, Folake lived a life so quiet that even suffering seemed to pass her by without witness. Years ago, she had been a wife, a woman who laughed easily, who believed tomorrow would come with gentle hands. But that life had been buried alongside her husband, Kunle Adeyemi, after a sudden roadside accident that took him and the child growing inside her on the same day. Since then, Folake had learned not to expect anything from life except endurance. She worked as a roadside tailor, her hands moving tirelessly over worn fabrics, stitching torn clothes for people who rarely remembered her name. By evening, she swept streets outside shops for a few extra naira, her back bent, her wrapper faded from too many washes. People passed her every day, some stepping around her, some stepping over her, but no one truly saw her. And Folake had grown used to that invisibility, until the first night. It was late, the kind of Lagos night where generators hummed like restless spirits and the air carried a mix of smoke and fried food. Folake had just finished sweeping outside a closed pharmacy when she heard a faint, broken cry. At first, she ignored it. In Lagos, cries were common. Hunger cried, pain cried, desperation cried, and if you stopped for every sound, you would never survive. But this one lingered. It wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding. It was weak, fading. Folake paused. She stood still, her broom resting against her shoulder, listening. There it was again, a child. Her chest tightened. She turned slowly toward the sound, her feet hesitant as if moving closer might awaken something she had buried deep inside herself. The cry led her to a narrow corner beside a small roadside church, one of those buildings painted bright colors but always locked at night. There, on a torn piece of cloth, lay a baby girl. The child was so small, so still, that for a terrifying moment Folake thought she was already gone. But then the baby moved just slightly and released another weak cry. Folake dropped her broom. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no." She looked around quickly. The street was empty. No mother, no footsteps. No explanation, just a child left behind like something unwanted. Folake's heart began to pound, not with excitement, but with fear. She knew what this meant. This was not her responsibility. This was danger. Taking the child would mean questions. It would mean feeding another mouth when she could barely feed herself. It would mean losing what little stability she had left. And yet, the baby's fingers twitched. Tiny, fragile, reaching. Folake swallowed hard. "Someone will come back," she muttered, more to convince herself than anything else. They must come back. She stepped away. One step, then another. But the cry followed her. Soft, weak, breaking. Folake stopped. Her breath grew uneven. She remembered another cry, the one she never got to hear. The child she never got to hold. The life that ended before it even began. Her hands began to shake. "God," she whispered, looking up into the dark sky. "Why would you bring this to me?" There was no answer, only silence, and the fading sound of a baby who would not last the night. Folake turned back. Slowly, reluctantly, as if surrendering to something she could no longer fight. She knelt beside the child, her knees pressing into the cold ground. Up close, the baby looked worse, skin too thin, lips dry, eyes barely open. "Hey, hey," Folake murmured, her voice softening instinctively. The baby's tiny hand brushed against her finger. That was all it took. Folake closed her eyes. And in that moment, she knew. Her life, already fragile, had just become impossible. She picked the baby up. The child was light, too light, and frighteningly warm against her chest. Folake held her close instinct, replacing fear, grief, replacing hesitation. "I don't have anything," she whispered. "I don't have food. I don't have money. I don't even have strength. The baby let out a small breath. Alive. Still alive. Folake tightened her hold. But I can't leave you, she said, her voice breaking. I just can't. That night, Folake Adeyemi walked home with nothing but a dying child in her arms and a decision that would change everything. Her one-room shack welcomed her the same way it always did, silent, dim, and unforgiving. She laid the baby on her thin mattress and lit a small kerosene lamp. The flickering light revealed just how serious the situation was. The child needed help. Immediately. Folake searched her room frantically, gathering what little she had, clean cloth water, leftover food she had been saving for herself. She tried to feed the baby, her hands clumsy, her heart racing. Stay with me, she whispered again and again. Please, stay with me. Hours passed. The night stretched endlessly, but the baby did not die. By morning, Folake had made her decision official, not with words but with action. She did not take the child back. She did not ask questions. She simply stayed, and in doing so, she unknowingly stepped into a life that would demand more than she had ever imagined giving. But Lagos was not finished with her yet, because 3 nights later, it happened again. Folake was returning from the market, her body aching from carrying loads for strangers who barely paid her. The baby, now wrapped securely against her back, had begun to breathe easier, though still fragile. Folake had not slept properly in days. She had not eaten properly either, but she kept going. Because now she was no longer alone. As she passed the same roadside church, something inside her tightened. A feeling. A warning. She slowed her steps. And then, a sound. Not a cry this time, but a faint movement. A rustle. Folake froze. Her heart began to race again. No, she whispered, shaking her head. It cannot be. But deep down, she already knew. She turned toward the corner, and there, sitting on the cold ground, was a little boy. He could not have been more than 3 years old. His clothes were dirty, his face streaked with dried tears, and in his hand he clutched a broken sandal as if it were the only thing he had left in the world. He did not cry. He did not call for help. He just sat there, waiting. Folake's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she couldn't move, because this time, it was worse. This was no abandoned infant. This was a child who knew, a child who had been left behind and understood it. The boy looked up slowly. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange something passed between them, something deeper than words, something that said, I have no one. Folake's knees weakened. Her body screamed at her to walk away. One child was already too much, too impossible, completely impossible. She could barely survive as it was. If she took him too, she might lose everything. Her home, her work, her life. Folake stood there, trembling between reason and something far more dangerous, compassion. The baby on her back stirred. The boy in front of her said nothing, but his eyes begged. And in that moment, Folake Adeyemi realized something terrifying. This was no coincidence. This was a test, not of wealth, not of strength, but of the kind of heart that chooses to love, even when it has nothing left to give. Folake closed her eyes, and then she stepped forward. Folake did not remember exactly how she got home that night. One moment she was standing in front of the silent boy, her heart pounding like it might tear through her chest. The next, she was walking, one child tied to her back, the other clinging to her fingers through the dim, uneven streets of Ahigunle. The boy did not resist. He did not speak either. He simply followed. When they reached her small room, Folake pushed the wooden door open with her shoulder. The baby stirred softly behind her, and the boy hesitated at the entrance, as if unsure whether he was truly allowed inside. Folake turned to him. It's okay, she said gently. You can come in. The boy stepped forward slowly, his bare feet dragging against the dusty floor. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the room, the thin mattress, the kerosene lamp, the single pot in the corner. There was nothing impressive, nothing comforting, but it was shelter. Folake untied the baby from her back and laid her carefully on the mattress. The child let out a soft breath, still weak but alive. Then she turned her attention to the boy. What is your name? She asked softly. The boy looked at her. For a long moment he said nothing, then almost in a whisper, Tunde. Folake nodded slowly as if sealing something sacred. Tunde, she repeated. That is a strong name. He said nothing more. His fingers tightened around the broken sandal. Folake knelt in front of him, her knees aching from the long day, her body heavy with exhaustion. My name is Folake, she said. You are safe here. The words felt strange on her tongue. Safe. She was not even sure if she could promise that. But she said it anyway, because he needed to hear it. That night, the room felt smaller than ever. 2 children, 1 fragile infant, 1 silent boy, and a woman who had almost nothing. Folake sat between them, her back against the wall, her eyes open long after the lamp burned low. She could hear Tunde's breathing uneven at first, then slowly settling into sleep. She could feel the baby's faint warmth beside her, and for the first time in years, the silence in her room was no longer empty. But it was heavy. Heavy with responsibility. Heavy with fear. Morning came too quickly. The sounds of Lagos returned, horns blaring, voices shouting, life rushing forward without pause. Folake rose slowly, her body stiff, her mind already racing. Food. She needed food. She checked the small container near the wall. Almost nothing. A handful of gari, some leftover water. That was all. She swallowed hard. Then she turned to Tunde. He was awake now, sitting quietly in the corner, watching her. Not asking, not complaining, just watching. Folake forced a small smile. We will eat soon, she said. Tunde nodded once. He did not ask how. That hurt her more than if he had cried. Folake prepared what little she had, mixing the gari into a thin paste. She fed the baby first, slowly, carefully. Then she turned to Tunde. Eat, she said, offering him the small portion. Tunde hesitated. Then he shook his head. You, he said quietly. Folake froze. No, she replied gently. You need it. Again he shook his head. His eyes were steady. Stubborn. I am okay. Folake felt something twist inside her chest. This child, this small boy, had already learned how to go without. She reached out and touched his cheek. You are not okay, she whispered, and you don't have to pretend anymore. Slowly she lifted the food to his lips. This time he accepted, and as he ate, Folake turned her face away, because she knew there would not be enough for her. Folake gave the baby a name. Ayo. Joy. Not because life was joyful, but because she needed to believe it could be again. Raising them was harder than anything she had ever faced. The baby cried through the night. Tunde barely spoke. Money disappeared faster than she could earn it. Folake took on more work, washing clothes, sweeping compounds, carrying loads at the market. Her hands became rougher, her back more bent. But still it was not enough. People began to notice, and then they began to talk. Folake has lost her mind. She picked up children from the street. They are not even from her blood. It will bring her bad luck. In places like Ajegunle, poverty was already a burden, but raising children that were not yours, that was seen as foolishness. Or worse, madness. One afternoon, her landlord Baba Sikiru came to her door. He did not greet her. He simply stood there, looking past her into the room. 2 children, he asked, his voice cold. Folake nodded slowly. Yes, Baba. He clicked his tongue. You could barely pay rent before. Folake lowered her gaze. I will pay, she said quietly. How he snapped, with what she had no answer. Baba Sikiru stepped inside his eyes, scanning every corner. This is not a charity house, he said. If you cannot pay, you leave. Folake's chest tightened. Please, she whispered. Give me time. He turned to her sharply. Time does not feed me. Then he pointed toward the door. 1 month. And he left. The room felt colder after he was gone. Folake stood there frozen. 1 month. She looked at Ayo sleeping weakly on the mattress. Then at Tunde, sitting quietly in the corner, watching everything. 1 month. It was impossible. But she had already chosen this path. And there was no turning back. That evening, Folake opened a small wooden box she had not touched in years. Inside, it wrapped carefully in cloth, was the last thing her husband had ever given her. A beautiful wrapper, bright, untouched by time. She held it in her hands, her fingers trembling. For a moment she closed her eyes. She remembered Kunle's smile, his voice, the life they had dreamed of. And then she opened her eyes again. That life was gone. But these children, they were here. Folake stood up slowly. The next morning she went to the market, and she sold it. The woman who bought it did not ask questions. She only counted the money. Folake took it with shaking hands. It was not much, but it was something. Enough for food, enough for medicine, enough to survive. For now, when she returned home, Tunde was waiting. He looked at the small bag in her hands, then at her face. "Where did it come from?" he asked. Folake forced a smile. "From something I no longer need." Tunde stared at her for a long moment, as if he understood more than she wanted him to. But he said nothing. That night, as the children slept, Folake sat alone again. The room was still small, still poor, still uncertain, but something had changed. She had crossed a line, given up something she could never get back. And in doing so, she had made a silent promise to these children, to herself. No matter how hard it became, no matter what she had to lose, she would not abandon them, not like the world had. By the time the rains came again, the small room in Ajagunle had learned to hold more than just bodies. It held survival. Water slipped through the zinc roof in thin, stubborn lines, tapping into bowls and old plastic containers Folake had arranged across the floor. At night, the rhythm of dripping water mixed with Ayo's soft breathing and the distant noise of generators creating a fragile lullaby that never quite let anyone rest. Still, life moved forward. Ayo had grown stronger. Her cries were no longer weak and fading, but full of life, demanding insistent, impossible to ignore. Her eyes followed Folake everywhere, as if afraid the woman might disappear the way the world had once disappeared on her. Tunde had changed too. He spoke more now, though only when necessary. He helped without being asked, fetching water, watching Ayo sweeping the small space as if it were something worth protecting. But there was something in him that did not change. He never laughed, not fully. And Folake noticed. One evening, as she returned from the market with a small bundle of fabric tied against her waist, she found Tunde sitting outside his elbows on his knees, staring at the dusty road. Ayo slept inside. "Tunde," she called gently. He looked up. There was no joy in his eyes, only awareness. "Why are you outside?" she asked. He shrugged. "It is hot inside." Folake stepped closer and sat beside him. The ground was still warm from the sun. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Folake said quietly, "You don't have to sit alone." Tunde didn't respond immediately. After a moment, he asked, "Will they come back?" Folake's breath caught. She knew what he meant. The people who left him. The people who never returned. Folake looked ahead, her eyes tracing the road as if it might carry answers. "I don't know," she said softly. Tunde nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Another silence. Then, almost too quietly to hear, "I waited," he said. "For a long time." Folake closed her eyes briefly. Something inside her ached not just for the boy, but for the version of him who had sat alone, hoping, believing. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not waiting anymore," she said. "You are here now." Tunde did not move. But he did not pull away either. And that, for him, was something. Days turned into months. Life became a pattern of exhaustion and small victories. Folake worked harder than ever. She woke before sunrise, tied Ayo to her back, and carried bundles to the market. When work was scarce, she cleaned compounds in wealthier areas, places where gates stood tall and people spoke to her without looking at her. Sometimes they gave her leftover food. Sometimes they gave her nothing. Still, she returned home every day, because now there was always someone waiting. But the world outside did not soften. If anything, it grew sharper. One afternoon, as Folake sat by her sewing machine outside a shop mending a torn blouse, a woman approached. She was well-dressed, her gilet perfectly tied, her gold jewelry catching the sunlight. Mrs. Balogun. Folake recognized her immediately. A woman of means, of influence. The kind of person who could change lives, or ignore them completely. Mrs. Balogun stood in front of Folake, her eyes scanning her slowly. "You are Folake," she said. It was not a question. Folake nodded. "Yes, ma. I have heard about you." Folake's hands stilled. That was never a good sign. Mrs. Balogun glanced toward the direction of Folake's home. "The children," she said. "They are not yours." Folake's grip tightened slightly on the fabric. They are mine, she replied quietly. Mrs. Balogun raised an eyebrow. By blood, Folake did not answer. The silence was enough. Mrs. Balogun sighed as if disappointed. You are struggling, she said. Everyone knows. Folake remained still. I can help you, Mrs. Balogun continued. Now Folake looked up. Help. How the woman smiled faintly. I cannot take both, she said, but I can take one. Folake's heart skipped. What do you mean, the girl Mrs. Balogun said simply. She is still young. She will adapt. I will raise her properly, education, comfort, a future. Folake felt her chest tighten. And the boy, she asked. Mrs. Balogun waved a hand dismissively. He is older. He will remember too much. The words fell like stones. Folake stared at her. You want me to separate them, she said. Mrs. Balogun tilted her head slightly. I want to give one of them a better life. Folake's hands began to tremble. A better life without her brother, she asked. Mrs. Balogun's expression hardened. You are thinking emotionally, she said. This is about survival. Folake stood slowly. Her legs felt weak, but her voice was steady. They survive together, she said. They will live together. Mrs. Balogun frowned. You are being foolish. Maybe Folake replied, but I will not divide what the world has already broken. A small crowd had begun to gather. People always watched, always listened. Mrs. Balogun stepped closer. You cannot feed them, she said sharply. You cannot protect them. You are holding them back. Folake swallowed. The words hurt because they carried truth, but not the whole truth. I may not have much, Folake said quietly, but I have not abandoned them. Think carefully, she warned. Opportunities like this do not come twice. Folake shook her head. I do not need it twice. She turned back to her sewing machine. The conversation was over. Mrs. Balogun stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the weight of that moment remained. That evening, Folake returned home later than usual. Tunde noticed immediately. You are tired, he said. Folake smiled faintly. I am always tired. But he shook his head. Not like this. She sat down slowly. Ayo crawled toward her, laughing softly, unaware of the storm that had almost changed her life. Folake pulled both children close. Her arms wrapped around them as tightly as her strength allowed. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she whispered, No one will take you away. Tunde looked at her. Who tried? He asked. Folake hesitated. Then she shook her head. It does not matter. But Tunde was not a child who forgot. His eyes darkened slightly. It matters, he said. Folake cupped his face gently. What matters, she said, is that you are here. Ayo babbled softly between them, and for the first time Tunde leaned into Folake. Just slightly, but enough. That night, as the rain began again, the small room felt different. Still poor, still leaking, still uncertain, but stronger, because something had been tested, and it had not broken. Folake lay awake long after the children slept, listening to the rain. She knew life would not get easier. She knew the world would keep offering shortcuts, choices that looked like salvation but came with quiet destruction. But she had already made her decision. She would raise them, together, no matter the cost. Even if the cost was everything. The first morning, Folake took Ayo and Tunde to school. The sun had barely risen, yet the weight of the day already pressed heavily on her chest. It was not just the heat of Lagos or the long walk from Ajagunle to the public primary school. It was something deeper, something she could not name, but felt clearly a quiet fear that the world her children were about to step into would not be kind to them. The school building stood worn and crowded, its faded paint peeling under years of neglect. Children filled the compound, their voices loud, their movements restless, their laughter sharp and unfiltered. Some wore clean uniforms, neatly pressed and bright. Others, like Ayo and Tunde, stood out not because they wanted to, but because poverty had a way of making itself visible no matter how carefully one tried to hide it. Ayo clung gently to Folake's hand, her small fingers warm but slightly trembling. Her uniform, though carefully sewn by Folake from old fabric, did not quite match the others. The stitching was visible, the color slightly uneven, but it had been made with love and desperation in equal measure. Tunde stood beside them, quiet and alert, his oversized shirt hanging loosely on his thin frame, his eyes already scanning the environment as if preparing for something he knew was coming. Folake bent down slowly, bringing herself to their level. She placed one hand on Ayo's shoulder and the other on Tunde's arm, grounding herself as much as them. "Stay together," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with unspoken concern. "Listen to your teachers, and remember who you are." Ayo nodded quickly, her eyes searching Folake's face for reassurance. "Will you come back for us?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Folake smiled, though her heart tightened painfully. "I will always come back," she replied, choosing certainty even when life had never guaranteed it. Tunde did not ask anything. He simply looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of her words before turning toward the classroom. There was no fear in his face, only a quiet readiness, the kind that came from having already faced more than most children his age ever should. Folake stood at the gate long after they disappeared into the crowd, her chest heavy with both pride and worry. She knew education was their only path forward, the only chance they had to escape the cycle that had trapped her for so long. But she also knew that stepping into that world meant stepping into judgment, into comparison, into a society that rarely showed mercy to those who had nothing. By the third day, her fears began to take shape. That afternoon, when Ayo returned home, something in her had changed. It was not something loud or obvious. There were no tears, no complaints, but a quiet withdrawal that Folake recognized immediately. Ayo moved more slowly, spoke less, and avoided eye contact, as though carrying a burden she did not yet know how to share. Folake waited until they were inside, until the door was closed, and the outside world felt distant enough for honesty. "Ayo," she said gently, kneeling in front of her, "tell me what happened." The girl hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her worn uniform. "Nothing," she replied softly, though her voice lacked its usual brightness. Folake did not press her immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to Tunde, who stood by the doorway, his posture rigid, his expression unusually tense. "They laughed at her," he said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. Ayo looked up quickly, almost pleading. "Tunde, please." But he continued, unable or unwilling to soften the truth. "They said her clothes smell. They said she looks like she came from the gutter." The words settled heavily in the room. Folake felt them like a physical blow, not because she had never heard such things before, but because now they had reached the children, because now the world had begun to teach them how it saw them. She turned back to Ayo, her expression softening. "Is that what happened?" she asked quietly. Ayo hesitated, then nodded, her eyes glistening, though she refused to let tears fall. "It's okay," she added quickly. "I didn't cry." Folake's heart ached at the strength in those words, the kind of strength no child should need. "It is not okay," she said gently, pulling Ayo into an embrace. "But you are strong, and I am proud of you." Tunde remained still, his silence now heavier than before. "And you?" Folake asked, looking at him. "What did you do?" Tunde's jaw tightened slightly. "I told them to stop, and when they didn't, she pressed." He met her gaze directly. "I made them stop." The next morning, Folake was called to the school. The teacher, Miss Okafor, spoke with measured patience, her tone neither harsh nor forgiving. She explained that Tunde had fought with other boys, 3 of them, and though no serious injuries had occurred, the behavior could not be ignored. Folake listened quietly, her hands clasped together in her lap, her thoughts moving between concern and understanding. She knew what the teacher saw: aggression, defiance, trouble. But she also knew what lay beneath it: fear, loyalty, and a deep, unspoken determination to protect the only family he had. When she returned home that evening, she found Tunde sitting outside, staring at the road as people passed by without noticing him. She sat beside him, allowing a moment of silence before speaking. "You cannot fight everyone," she said gently. Tunde did not look at her. "Then they will keep hurting her." Folake nodded slowly. "Maybe they will, but fighting will not teach them respect. It will only teach them fear." Tunde turned slightly, his expression conflicted. "Fear is enough." Folake shook her head. "No, fear disappears when you are not there. But respect stays even when you are gone." He said nothing. After a while, his voice softened. "I don't know how to be like that." Folake placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will learn," she said. "Not in one day, not in one moment, but you will." The real struggle, however, was not only emotional, it was practical. School required money. Fees had to be paid. Books had to be bought. Uniforms needed to be replaced. And each of those needs stood like a wall between the children and their future. When Folake stood at the payment office and was told her money was not enough, she felt a familiar helplessness rise within her. It was not anger. It was not even despair. It was something quieter, a recognition that no matter how hard she worked, the world always demanded more than she could give. Still, she refused to step back. That same afternoon, she walked into a part of Lagos she rarely entered, streets lined with clean houses, tall gates, and people who did not carry their struggles on their faces. She knocked on doors, offering her labor with humility and quiet determination. Most turned her away. One did not. Mrs. Ijeoma gave her work hard, demanding relentless work, but it came with something Folake needed more than comfort income. And so she endured. She cleaned until her hands burned, washed until her fingers ached, and stood for hours without rest. Every movement was driven by one purpose: to keep Ayo and Tunde in school, to keep their future alive. But even that sacrifice did not shield them from the world. One evening, as Folake returned home, she heard voices ahead, laughter sharp and cutting. When she turned the corner, she saw Tunde standing in the middle of a small group of women, their words directed at him with careless cruelty. "She should have left you where she found you," one said. Another added, "Now she suffers because of you." Folake felt her chest tighten as she stepped forward. "Enough," she said firmly. The women turned, their expressions shifting from mockery to mild irritation. But Folake did not engage them. She walked straight to Tunde, her focus entirely on him. "Let's go," she said quietly. Tunde did not move immediately. His voice, when it came, was low but heavy with belief. "They are right." Folake's heart broke, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. She reached for his face, guiding his eyes to hers. "No," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "They are not." He searched her expression, as if trying to find even the smallest trace of doubt. "You are not my burden," she continued softly. "You are my reason." The words settled into the silence around them, stronger than the voices that had come before. Slowly, something in Tunde shifted. His shoulders relaxed, his fists loosened, and without another word, he stepped closer to her. Folake took his hand, and together they walked home, not free from struggle, not protected from pain, but anchored by something the world could not easily break. The rainy season returned with a kind of quiet violence that Lagos understood too well. It did not arrive with warning or mercy. It simply came heavy and relentless, turning streets into rivers and weakness into disaster. For Folake, it was not just another season, it was a test she could not avoid. The roof of her small room, already fragile, began to give in to the pressure of constant rain. At first, it was only a few drops falling steadily into the bowls she had arranged with careful precision. But within days, the dripping turned into streams, and the streams into a slow invasion that crept across the floor, soaking their thin mattress and everything they owned. At night, the children huddled close to her, their bodies pressed together for warmth as the sound of rain hammered against the zinc sheets above. Ayo coughed softly in her sleep, her small frame shivering despite Folake's attempts to wrap her in every dry piece of cloth they had left. Tunde stayed awake longer than he should have, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if watching for the moment it might collapse entirely. Folake lay between them, her body aching, her mind refusing rest. She counted every drop, every breath, every second. Because in a life like hers, survival was not a given, it was something fought for moment by moment. By morning, the damage was clear. Their mattress was soaked beyond use. Their clothes clung damply to their skin. The little food they had managed to store had been ruined by water. The room no longer felt like shelter, it felt like something temporary, something that could disappear at any moment. Still, Folake did not allow herself to stop. She rose before the children woke, stepping into the muddy street with determination that masked her exhaustion. Work was harder to find during the rains, but need did not lessen, and neither did her responsibility. She carried loads at the market under the downpour, her wrapper soaked through her feet, slipping in the mud. She cleaned compounds where rainwater flooded courtyards, scrubbing surfaces that would be dirty again within hours. Every task felt heavier, every movement slower, but she pushed through because there was no alternative. When she returned home one afternoon, she found Tunde outside, his shirt damp, his expression unusually guarded. "Why are you here?" she asked, concern tightening her voice. "I finished early," he replied. Folake frowned slightly, and Ayo Tunde hesitated. "She is inside." Something in his tone made Folake move faster. She stepped into the room and immediately saw the change. Ayo lay curled on the mattress, her face flushed, her breathing uneven. The faint strength she had built over the past months seemed to have disappeared overnight, replaced by a fragile stillness that sent fear rushing through Folake's body. "Ayo," she called softly, kneeling beside her. The girl opened her eyes weakly. "I'm cold," she whispered. Folake's heart clenched. She touched Ayo's forehead. Too hot. Far too hot. Fear moved quickly now, sharper, louder. "We need to go to the clinic," Folake said, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. Tunde stepped closer. "Do we have money?" The question hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. Folake did not answer immediately, because the truth was simple. No, they did not. But that truth could not be allowed to decide what happened next. "We are going," she said firmly. She wrapped Ayo carefully, lifting her into her arms, ignoring the strain in her own body. Tunde followed closely, his steps quick, his face set with determination. The clinic was crowded as it always was during the rainy season. Mothers sat with sick children, their faces lined with worry and exhaustion. The smell of antiseptic mixed with damp clothes and quiet desperation filled the air. Folake waited. Minutes stretched into hours. Ayo's breathing grew heavier. Her body felt hotter. Tunde stood beside them, silent but alert, watching everything, absorbing everything. When they were finally called in, the nurse examined Ayo quickly, her expression tightening with concern. "She has a serious infection," she said. "She needs treatment immediately." Folake nodded. "Yes." The nurse wrote something down, then handed it over. "Pay at the front." Folake took the paper with trembling hands. She already knew. But still she looked. The amount was more than she had seen in weeks. Her chest tightened. I will pay," she said quietly. The nurse nodded already, turning to the next patient. Outside, Folake stood still for a moment, the noise of the clinic fading around her. Tunde watched her carefully. "We don't have it," he said. Folake closed her eyes briefly. "No," she admitted. Ayo stirred weakly in her arms. "I don't want to die," the girl whispered. The words were soft, barely audible, but they cut through everything. Folake's eyes snapped open. "No," she said immediately, her voice breaking. "You are not going to die." She looked around, her mind racing. Then she made a decision, the kind of decision that did not ask for permission. "Stay here," she told Tunde. "I'm coming with you," he replied. "No," she said firmly. "Stay with her." For a moment he looked like he might argue. Then he nodded. Folake turned and ran. The rain had started again, heavy and unforgiving, but she barely felt it. Her feet moved faster than her thoughts, carrying her through streets blurred by water and urgency. She reached home breathless, her chest heaving. Inside the room looked worse than before. Damp, cold, bare. Her eyes moved quickly, searching. There was nothing left. Nothing except one thing. Her rent money, carefully hidden. Her only guarantee that they would not be thrown out at the end of the month. Folake stared at it. Her hands began to shake. If she used it, they would lose their home. If she didn't, she might lose Ayo. The choice was not complicated. It was devastating. Folake picked up the money. Her fingers tightened around it as if holding on to something fragile. Then she turned and ran again, back through the rain, back to the clinic, back to the place where her child was waiting. When she returned, Tunde looked up immediately. Folake said nothing. She simply handed the money over at the front desk. Minutes later, Ayo was taken in for treatment. Time slowed. Every second stretched. Every breath felt heavier than the last. Tunde stood beside Folake, his voice quiet. "We will be okay," he said. Folake looked down at him. She wanted to believe that. She needed to. But she also knew something he did not. They had just crossed another line, another sacrifice, and this one would not go unnoticed. Because somewhere waiting at the end of the month was a man who did not accept excuses, and a door that might soon be closed to them forever. Ayo survived the night, but survival, Folake had learned, did not mean safety. It only meant that a new kind of struggle was waiting on the other side of relief. When the fever finally broke 2 days later, it did not come with celebration. It came quietly, like the slow retreat of something dangerous that might still return if given the chance. Ayo's breathing steadied her small body, no longer burning under Folake's trembling hands, and for the first time in days, Folake allowed herself to sit without fear, tightening her chest. But the cost of that survival stood silently in the corner of her mind. The rent money was gone, and time did not forget. At the end of the month, as the sky hung low with heavy clouds, and the air carried the damp scent of another coming rain, Baba Sikiru returned. He did not knock gently. He struck the door with the flat of his palm, sharp and impatient, the sound echoing through the small room like a warning. Folake rose slowly, her body still weakened from days of worry and sleepless nights. Io sat quietly on the mattress, her strength only beginning to return, while Tunde stood near the doorway, already alert, already aware of what this visit meant. Folake opened the door. Baba Sikiru stood there, his expression unchanged, his eyes scanning the room before settling back on her. "My money," he said. No greeting, no pretense, just demand. Folake lowered her gaze briefly, gathering what little steadiness she could find. "I need more time," she said quietly. Baba Sikiru's face hardened. "You said that last time." "I know," Folake replied. "But my child was sick. I had to. I am not her father," he interrupted sharply. "I am not responsible for your problems." The words landed heavily, not because they were new, but because they were always true in a world like theirs. Folake clasped her hands together. "I will pay," she said again. "Just give me a little more time." Baba Sikiru stepped forward, his presence filling the small space. "You think this is a charity?" he asked. "You think I run this place for pity?" Folake shook her head. "No." "Then you leave," he said simply. The room fell into silence. Io looked up, confusion flickering across her face. Tunde's jaw tightened, his body already shifting as if preparing to stand between Folake and whatever came next. "Please," Folake said, her voice soft but urgent. "Where will we go?" Baba Sikiru did not hesitate. "That is not my concern." He turned toward the door. "You have until sunset." And then he was gone. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything he had said. Folake stood still for a long moment. Then she turned back into the room. Ao was watching her. Tunde was watching her, waiting, not for answers, but for direction. Folake took a slow breath. "We will pack," she said. There was no panic in her voice, no visible fear, only quiet acceptance. Because in her life this was not the first time she had lost something, and she knew better than to waste energy on disbelief. Tunde moved first. He gathered what little they had, clothes, a few utensils, the small kerosene lamp. His movements were efficient, controlled as though he had always known this day might come. Io tried to help, though her strength was still fragile. She folded pieces of cloth carefully, her small hands working with a seriousness that did not belong to her age. Folake packed last. She looked around the room slowly, her eyes taking in every corner, every mark on the wall, every memory embedded in the space. This place had never been much, but it had been theirs, and now it was gone. By sunset, they stepped outside. Everything they owned fit into 2 small bundles. The sky darkened above them, heavy with the promise of more rain. Folake adjusted the cloth on her head, balancing one bundle while Tunde carried the other. Io held onto Falake's wrapper, her grip tight, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Where are we going?" she asked softly. Folake paused. She did not have an answer, but she could not say that. "We will find a place," she said gently. And then they began to walk. The streets of Lagos did not slow for them. People passed by, rushing, shouting, living their own lives, barely noticing the small family moving quietly along the roadside with nowhere to go. Night came quickly. The rain followed. At first it was light, a soft drizzle that dampened the ground and cooled the air. But within minutes it grew heavier, stronger, until it fell in thick sheets that blurred the world around them. Folake pulled Io closer, shielding her as best she could. Tunde walked beside them, his shoulders squared, his eyes scanning for any place that might offer cover. Finally they found it, an unfinished kiosk near a transport yard. The structure was incomplete, just concrete walls and a partial roof, but it was enough to block the rain. They stepped inside. Water still seeped through the edges, but it was better than the open street. Folake set down their bundles, her body aching with exhaustion. Io sat quietly, her small frame trembling slightly. Tunde remained standing, his eyes fixed on the outside as if guarding the space. "This will do," Folake said softly. It was not comfort, it was not safety, but it was shelter. For now. That night, they lay on the bare floor. No mattress, no warmth beyond what they could give each other. The sounds of the transport yard filled the air, engines, voices, movement that never fully stopped. Io slept quickly, her body too tired to resist. Folake lay beside her, one arm wrapped protectively around her small form. Tunde remained awake. After a while, he spoke. "Do you regret it?" Folake opened her eyes. "What?" He hesitated, then turned slightly toward her. "Taking us," he said. "If you didn't, you would still have your room. You would not be here." The question settled heavily in the space between them. Folake looked at him carefully, at the boy who had learned too early how to measure his worth against suffering, at the child who believed love could be a mistake. Slowly, she pushed herself up and sat facing him. "Tunde," she said gently. He did not look away. "If I had left you there," she continued, her voice steady, "I would have lost something far greater than a room." He frowned slightly. Folake reached out and placed her hand over his. "Myself," she said. The word hung in the air. Quiet. Powerful. Tunde's expression shifted, confusion mixing with something deeper. Folake continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "A house can be taken," she said. "Money can be lost. But the kind of person you choose to be, that is something only you can give away." Tunde's gaze dropped to their hands. "And you chose us," he said. Folake nodded. "I chose you." Silence followed. But it was not the same kind of silence as before. It was softer, fuller. Tunde lay down slowly, closer than he had before. Not quite touching, but near enough. Folake lay back beside Io, her body still aching, her future still uncertain. The rain continued outside. The world remained hard. Nothing had been solved. Nothing had become easier. But something inside that unfinished kiosk had shifted. Not in their circumstances, but in their understanding. And sometimes that was the only kind of strength they had. The months that followed did not announce themselves with dramatic change. There was no sudden miracle, no unexpected rescue that lifted Folake and the children out of hardship. Instead, life continued the way it often does for people like them, quietly, steadily, and with a weight that never truly disappeared, but became something they learned to carry. The unfinished kiosk near the transport yard became their new reality. What had first felt like a temporary shelter slowly turned into something resembling a home, not because it offered comfort, but because it was the only place that did not push them away. The noise of engines, the shouts of drivers, and the constant movement of people became part of their daily rhythm. At night, the ground was still hard, the air still thick. But they adjusted. They always did. Folake rebuilt her life piece by piece. She found small tailoring jobs again, mending torn clothes for drivers and traders who passed through the area. The work paid little, but it gave her something she needed beyond money, a sense of control, however fragile. She also began cleaning stalls early in the morning before the transport yard became crowded, her body moving with practiced endurance, her mind always calculating what the day might bring. Tunde, now older and more aware, refused to remain a child in the way the world expected. Without asking for permission, he began helping at the motor park. At first, it was small tasks, carrying loads, fetching tools, running errands for drivers who barely acknowledged him. But he watched everything. He learned quickly. How engines sounded when something was wrong, how people negotiated, how money moved, even in the smallest amounts. Folake noticed. She saw the quiet determination in him, the way he returned each day with a few coins in his hand, offering them without pride, without expectation. "You should be resting," she told him one evening, her voice gentle but firm. Tunde shook his head. "We need it." Folake wanted to argue to protect what remained of his childhood, but she also understood something difficult, that survival had already taken parts of that childhood long ago. What remained was not innocence, but resilience. So instead, she said, "Then you must also study. Both are important." Tunde nodded. "I will." And he meant it. Io, meanwhile, began to change in a different way. Her strength returned slowly after the illness, but something else grew alongside it, something sharper, brighter. She listened more carefully in school, asked more questions, and spent her evenings reading whatever materials she could borrow. Sometimes it was old textbooks, sometimes torn pages from discarded notebooks, but she treated each one like something precious. One afternoon, Folake returned early and found Io sitting just outside the kiosk, a book resting on her lap, her lips moving silently as she read. "What are you studying?" Folake asked, sitting beside her. Io looked up, her eyes lighting up in a way that made Folake pause. "It's about the body," she said. "About how people get sick, and how they get better." Folake smiled faintly. "You want to understand it." Io nodded. "I don't want people to die because they don't have money," she said softly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight far beyond her years. Folake felt something stir deep within her, not pride alone, but something closer to hope. "You want to become a nurse?" she asked. Io shook her head. "A doctor." Folake looked at her carefully, searching her face for hesitation, for doubt, but there was none. Only certainty. "It is not easy," Folake said gently. Io held her gaze. "I know. And it will take time. I know. And we do not have much." Io smiled slightly. "We have enough to start." Folake did not speak for a moment, because in that quiet confidence she saw something she had almost forgotten existed. Possibility. But while the children were growing stronger, Folake was slowly weakening. It was not something she allowed them to see clearly. She hid it in small ways, by turning away when she felt dizzy, by sitting down only when they were not looking, by forcing her body to continue even when it protested. The years of strain, the long days without rest, the sacrifices that had accumulated one after another, they had not disappeared. They had settled inside her quietly, taking their toll. One afternoon, as she worked on a sewing job under the heat of the sun, her vision blurred. The needle slipped. Her hand trembled. Before she could steady herself, the world tilted. She collapsed. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying on the ground, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. Voices murmured above her. She fainted. "She works too hard. Someone bring water." Folake pushed herself up slowly, ignoring the concern in their voices. "I'm fine," she said. But she wasn't. That evening she returned home later than usual. Tunde noticed immediately. "You look different," he said. Folake forced a small smile. "Just tired." Io looked at her closely, her expression more observant than before. "You need to rest," she said. Folake shook her head gently. "We cannot afford rest." But Io did not accept that answer. "Then we will help more," she said. Folake looked at her, surprised. "You already help." Io's voice softened. "We can do more." Tunde nodded in agreement. "We will." Folake felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not pain, but something more complicated. Gratitude and guilt, because she knew what they were offering. Not just effort, but pieces of themselves. "No," she said firmly, though her voice remained gentle. "You will focus on your future. That is your work." Tunde frowned slightly. "And yours," Folake held his gaze. "My work is to make sure you have one." The conversation ended there, but the understanding remained. Time continued to move, slowly, quietly, and with it something else began to take shape. Not in their circumstances, not in their surroundings, but in who they were becoming. Io, with her growing knowledge and quiet determination, began helping others in small ways, explaining lessons to classmates, assisting younger children, even offering comfort to those who were sick or afraid. Tunde, with his sharp awareness and steady discipline, gained the trust of people in the motor park. He was no longer just a boy running errands. He was someone others began to rely on. And Folake watched. She watched them become more than what the world had expected, more than what she had dared to hope, and though her body grew weaker, her spirit held on to one quiet truth, that everything she had given, everything she had lost, was slowly becoming something greater than survival. It was becoming a future. Time did not transform their lives overnight. It reshaped them gradually, like water wearing down stone. By the time Io and Tunde stepped fully into late adolescence, the world still saw them as children of the margins, yet something within them had begun to rise beyond those limits. The kiosk remained their home, though it no longer felt as fragile as it once had. Over the years, Tunde had reinforced parts of the structure with discarded wood and metal sheets collected from the motor park. It was still crude, still far from safe, but it held. And in a life built on uncertainty, something that held was not a small thing. Io, now taller, carried herself with a quiet confidence that had not existed before. Her voice was soft, but when she spoke, people listened. Teachers began to notice her, not just for her intelligence, but for her discipline, her consistency, and the way she approached learning as if it were not a privilege, but a necessity. Tunde, on the other hand, had grown into a presence people could not ignore. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with clarity and purpose. At the motor park, he was no longer just helping, he was learning, negotiating, observing how systems worked, how people built something out of nothing, and how respect once earned could become its own form of currency. Folake watched both of them with a quiet awareness that deepened each day. She did not speak often about the future, but she thought about it constantly. Because now the future was no longer an idea. It was close. And with it came new challenges, ones that required more than endurance. They required resources. The first opportunity came to Io. It arrived in the form of a letter folded official, carrying a weight that none of them fully understood until it was opened. Io held it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. Tunde stood beside her watching. Folake remained seated, her eyes fixed on Io's face, searching for meaning before the words were even spoken. Io read silently at first, then again. And then she looked up. "I was selected," she said, her voice almost disbelieving, "for a scholarship program in Ibadan." The words hung in the air. For a moment, no one moved. "What does it mean?" Folake asked quietly. Io swallowed. "It means, if I pass the final assessment, they will sponsor my education. I can study medicine." The room seemed to shift, not physically, but in possibility. Tunde exhaled slowly. "That is good." But his voice carried something more than approval. It carried understanding, because nothing in their lives came without cost. "What do you need?" Folake asked. Io hesitated. "Transport, documents, some fees for the process. Not everything is covered." The silence returned. Heavy, familiar. How much, Folake wanted to ask, but she already knew the answer would not be small. At the same time, another opportunity began to form for Tunde. One of the older men at the motor park, Alhaji Musa, had been watching him for years. Not closely, not in a way that suggested special attention, but enough to recognize consistency, discipline, and something else that could not be taught. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the day's work began to slow, Alhaji Musa called him over. "You are no longer a boy," he said simply. Tunde nodded. "I know." Alhaji Musa studied him for a moment. "I am expanding my transport line," he continued. "I need someone I can trust to help manage operations, not just carry loads, manage." Tunde listened carefully. "There will be training," the man added, "and responsibility." Tunde understood what that meant. "And money?" he asked. Alhaji Musa nodded. "But you must commit, fully." Tunde did not answer immediately, because he knew something Alhaji Musa did not. Commitment for him had never been the problem. Opportunity was. That night he returned home with the news. Folake listened as both children spoke, Io with quiet excitement, Tunde with controlled seriousness. Their voices overlapped at times, each trying to explain what this moment could mean. And as Folake listened, she felt something both beautiful and terrifying unfold inside her. They were ready. The world was opening. But the door still required something she did not have. Money. Always money. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Folake sat alone outside the kiosk. The air was still the noise of the motor park, reduced to distant murmurs. For once, the world felt almost quiet. But her thoughts were not. She replayed their words in her mind: scholarship, training opportunity, future. This was what she had fought for, what she had sacrificed everything for. And now that it was here, she was not sure she could reach it. Her eyes drifted to the small cloth pouch she kept hidden beneath her wrapper. She had not opened it in years. Slowly, she reached for it. Her fingers hesitated, then continued. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of fabric, was a single item. A ring. Simple, worn, but precious beyond measure. Her wedding ring. The last physical memory of the life she had once lived with Kunle. For years she had protected it, not because of its value in money, but because of what it represented. It was not just a piece of gold. It was a piece of her past. A reminder that once she had been more than survival. Once she had been loved in a way that felt whole. She held it now, her fingers trembling slightly. "If I let this go," she whispered to herself. The thought did not need to be completed, because she already knew she would not get it back. Not this time. Not ever. Folake closed her eyes. For a moment she allowed herself to feel everything: the memory of her husband, the life they had planned, the child they had lost, the years of loneliness that followed. And then she opened her eyes again, because in front of her now were two children who were no longer children. 2 lives that had grown from nothing into something that could change everything. Folake stood slowly. The next morning she went to the market. The gold buyer did not ask questions. He examined the ring, weighed it, and named a price. Folake did not bargain. She simply nodded. When the money was placed in her hands, it felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its amount, but because of what it had cost. When she returned home, Ayo and Tunde were waiting. They looked at her expectantly. Folake smiled gently. "It is enough," she said. Ayo's eyes widened. How Folake shook her head. "It does not matter." But Tun's gaze lingered. He had learned to read what was not said. "Something is gone," he said quietly. Folake met his eyes. Yes. Tunde did not ask what, because he already understood. Some sacrifices did not need to be explained. They only needed to be honored. That evening, as they sat together, something shifted again. Not in their situation, not in their surroundings, but in their direction. For the first time, the future did not feel distant. It felt possible. But beneath that possibility, something else remained. A truth that had not yet revealed itself. Because the path ahead was not only about success, it was about understanding where they had come from and why. The departure did not feel like a triumph. It felt like a quiet separation that none of them fully knew how to name. On the morning Ayo left for Ibadan, the sky was unusually clear, as though Lagos had decided just for a moment not to weigh heavily on those who were already carrying too much. The motor park was busy, filled with voices, calling destinations, engines revving, and passengers negotiating fares. It was the kind of chaos that usually swallowed individual stories whole. But for Folake, Ayo, and Tunde, everything felt sharply defined. Ayo stood beside a worn bus, her small travel bag held tightly in both hands. It contained only what was necessary: clothes, a few books, and documents that represented a future still uncertain but finally within reach. Folake adjusted the edge of Ayo's scarf, her fingers lingering slightly longer than needed. "You must eat well," she said softly, "and rest when you can." Ayo smiled faintly. "I will, and do not be afraid to ask questions." "I won't." Folake nodded, though there were many more things she wanted to say, warnings, advice, prayers, but she knew too many words would only make leaving harder. So she said the one thing that mattered most. "Remember who you are." Ayo's eyes softened. "I will never forget." Tunde stood slightly apart, his arms folded, his expression calm but distant. He had not spoken much that morning, and Folake understood why. For someone like him, change was not something to celebrate. It was something to observe carefully, to measure, to prepare for. Ayo turned to him. "You will come and visit," she said. Tunde nodded once. "Yes, not just once," she added. A small pause. "I will come when I can." Ayo studied him for a moment, as if trying to read what lay beneath his words. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. At first, he did not move. Then slowly he returned the gesture, not tightly, but enough. When the conductor called for passengers to board, the moment ended. And as the bus pulled away, carrying Ayo toward a future none of them had ever truly imagined possible, something shifted in the space between those who remained. The kiosk felt emptier that night, not because it had changed physically, but because something essential was missing. Ayo's quiet voice, her steady presence, the balance she had brought into their small family, all of it had moved elsewhere. Folake sat longer than usual, her hands resting idly in her lap. Tunde noticed. "You are thinking too much," he said. Folake looked at him. "That is what mothers do." Tunde nodded slightly. "She will be fine." Folake smiled faintly. "I know." But knowing did not remove the feeling. It only made it bearable. Life continued. It always did. Tunde stepped more fully into the opportunity Alhaji Musa had offered him. The work was no longer about simple tasks. It required awareness, decision-making, and a level of responsibility that most young men his age had never experienced. He learned quickly how to track vehicles, how to manage schedules, how to handle disagreements without escalating them, and most importantly, how to earn trust. At first, the older men at the motor park watched him with skepticism. He was young, quiet, and carried himself with a seriousness that did not always fit their expectations. But over time, that skepticism changed. Not because he demanded respect, but because he proved himself consistently. Folake observed this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. One evening, as Tunde returned later than usual, she noticed the change in his posture, the way he moved, the way he carried himself. "You are becoming someone else," she said gently. Tunde sat down across from her. "No," he replied. "I am becoming who I need to be." Folake studied him carefully. "And who is that?" Tunde paused. "Someone who will not be pushed aside again." The words were calm, but they carried weight. Folake nodded slowly. "That is good," she said. "But do not forget, strength without kindness becomes something else." Tunde did not respond immediately, but her words stayed. Meanwhile, in Ibadan, Ayo's world expanded in ways she had never experienced before. The school was larger, more structured, filled with students who came from backgrounds she had only seen from a distance. Some had never known hunger. Some had never questioned whether they would have a place to sleep at night. At first, Ayo felt the difference sharply, not through direct cruelty but through subtle distance, the way others spoke, the confidence they carried, the assumptions they made. But Ayo did not retreat. She observed, she learned, and she adapted. Her focus remained unchanged. Every lecture, every assignment, every opportunity to learn, she approached it with the same quiet determination that had carried her through childhood. And slowly, people began to notice. Not her clothes, not her background, but her ability, her consistency, her purpose. One of her lecturers, Dr. Adewale, called her aside after class one day. "You ask questions differently," he said. Ayo hesitated slightly. "I want to understand fully," she replied. Dr. Adewale nodded. "That is rare." He studied her for a moment. "You are not here by accident." Ayo held his gaze. "I know." But while both Ayo and Tunde were moving forward, something else was beginning to unfold behind the scenes. A woman named Iya Sade had been watching quietly. She was not wealthy, nor was she powerful in the way people often recognized, but she carried something more subtle, memory, patience, and a deep understanding of things others preferred to forget. Years ago, she had worked as an assistant to a midwife in a small private clinic on the outskirts of Lagos. It had not been a place people spoke about openly. It was discreet, quiet, and often used by families who needed situations handled without attention. Situations involving births that were not meant to be known. Situations involving children who were not meant to remain. Ayasade had left that work long ago, but she had not forgotten. And recently something had begun to trouble her. 2 stories, 2 abandoned children, left near the same roadside church. Years apart, but not too far apart. It did not feel like coincidence. So she began to ask questions, carefully, quietly. She returned to places she had not visited in years. She spoke to people who preferred not to remember. She followed fragments of information that did not yet form a complete picture but hinted at something deeper, something intentional. One evening she stood near the church, where it had all begun. The building looked the same, faded, locked, unremarkable, but Ayasade knew better. She stood there for a long time, her eyes scanning the area, her mind connecting pieces that had remained scattered for too long. "These children," she murmured softly. Her voice was barely audible. "They were not just left." The realization settled slowly, but firmly. And with it came something else. The understanding that whatever truth lay beneath their story had been buried. On purpose, far away, unaware of the quiet investigation beginning to take shape, Folake sat outside the kiosk once more, watching the evening settle over the motor park. Her body felt heavier these days. Her movements slower, but her mind remained clear. She thought of Ayo. She thought of Tunde. She thought of the path that had brought them here. And for a moment she allowed herself to believe something she had not dared to fully accept before, that maybe, just maybe, everything she had endured was leading somewhere. Not just for survival, but for something greater, something that had not yet revealed itself. By the time Ayo completed her early years in medical training, and Tunde had firmly established himself within the transport business, their lives had begun to take on a shape that neither of them could have imagined in childhood. It was not a perfect life, nor an easy one, but it was no longer defined solely by survival. It had direction, and more importantly, it had impact. Io returned to Lagos more often now, not as the fragile girl who once clung to Folake's wrapper, but as a young woman with steady hands and a mind sharpened by knowledge and purpose. She had begun working with a small community clinic during her breaks, choosing deliberately to serve in places that reminded her of where she had come from. The first time she treated a child whose illness could have been prevented with basic care, something inside her shifted. It was not anger. It was not sadness. It was clarity. She began to understand that what she had survived was not an isolated story. It was a pattern, a system that allowed some to live comfortably while others struggled for the most basic chance to survive, and she could no longer stand at a distance from it. "You are working too hard," Folake told her, one evening, watching as Io carefully arranged medical supplies inside the kiosk, preparing for the next day's outreach. Io smiled slightly. "You taught me that," she replied. Folake shook her head gently. "I taught you to endure," she said, "not to carry everything." Io paused, then looked at her. "I am not carrying everything," she said softly, "just what I can." Folake studied her daughter's face, the quiet determination, the controlled strength, and recognized something familiar. Not just resilience, responsibility. And though it filled her with pride, it also brought a quiet concern she did not voice, because she knew what it meant to give everything. She had lived that life. Meanwhile, Tunde's world had expanded beyond the motor park. What began as responsibility under Alhaji Musa had grown into something larger: coordination, logistics, decision-making at a level that required both intelligence and discipline. He had earned trust, not through words but through consistency, and that trust had opened doors. He now handled operations for multiple routes, managed drivers, and negotiated contracts that brought steady income not just to himself but to others connected to the business. People began to know his name, not as the boy from Ajagunle, but as someone capable, reliable, important. Yet despite this growth, Tunde remained grounded in ways that were not immediately visible to those around him. Every decision he made carried an awareness shaped by his past. Every opportunity he accepted came with an understanding of what it meant to have none. One evening after a long day, he returned to the kiosk to find Folake sitting outside her posture, slightly more slumped than usual. "You did not rest again," he said, his tone calm but firm. Folake smiled faintly. "I rested." Tunde did not argue. Instead, he sat beside her. "You should not still be here," he said, after a moment. Folake looked at him. "Where should I be?" "In a better place," he replied. "Somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe." Folake's expression softened. "This is safe enough." Tunde shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "This is what we survived, not what we should remain in." Folake did not respond immediately, because she understood what he was saying. But she also understood something he did not. "This place," she said, "slowly reminds me of who we are." Tunde turned to her. "And if we forget," Folake met his gaze, "then we risk becoming like the people who looked at us and saw nothing." The words settled between them. Tunde looked away slightly, his thoughts shifting. He had seen those people. He had learned from them. But he had also learned something else. That power could change how the world listened to you, and he intended to use that. At the same time, Ayasade's investigation had begun to reveal pieces that could no longer be ignored. It had taken months of careful inquiry, of returning to places long abandoned and speaking to individuals who preferred silence. But slowly the fragments began to form a pattern. The clinic, where she had once worked, had been shut down years ago, under unclear circumstances. Officially, it was due to administrative issues. Unofficially, there had been rumors, whispers of arrangements made for wealthy families who needed certain problems to disappear quietly. Pregnancies that could not be acknowledged, children that could not be kept. Iyasade had not been involved in those decisions, but she had seen enough to understand how such systems operated. Now, as she followed the trail, she discovered records that had not been properly destroyed, names that appeared and disappeared, dates that aligned too closely with the nights Folake had found the children. Two cases stood out, one involving a young woman from a prominent family who had been sent away during a medical emergency. Another involving a business associate whose household had quietly dismissed several staff members within the same period. Neither case had official documentation of a child, but the timing, the location, the silence. It was too precise. These children were not abandoned, Ayasade said to herself as she reviewed the information. They were removed. The realization carried weight far beyond curiosity. It suggested intention, decision, and perhaps responsibility that had never been acknowledged. Unaware of how close the past was to resurfacing, Ayo and Tunde began to feel the pull of something they had never fully questioned before. It started with small things, questions that had never been asked, memories that did not align. Tunde was the first to voice it. One evening as he and Ayo sat together outside the kiosk, he spoke without preamble. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked. Ayo looked at him. "About what?" before he said. "Before we came here." Ayo hesitated. "I don't remember much." Tunde nodded. "I do," he said quietly. She turned slightly toward him. "What do you remember?" Tunde's gaze remained fixed ahead. "Voices," he said. "Arguments. People who did not want me there." Ayo felt something tighten in her chest. "And then nothing," he replied. "Just being alone." Ayo lowered her eyes. "I was too small," she said. "I don't remember anything, Tunde." Tunde nodded again. "But someone does," he said. "What do you mean?" Tunde turned to her. "Someone knows what happened," he said. "And one day, we will find out." The statement was not emotional. It was not driven by anger. It was simply certain. Ayo studied him for a moment. Then she asked quietly, "And when we do, what will change?" Tunde did not answer immediately, because the truth was not simple. Finally, he said, "I don't know." That night, as Folake lay resting inside the kiosk, her breathing slightly uneven, she watched the shadows move across the ceiling. She could hear their voices outside. She knew what they were beginning to question, and though she had always prepared them for the future, this was something she had never fully prepared herself for. Because some truths did not only reveal the past, they changed everything that came after. The questions once spoken did not fade. They settled into the quiet spaces between Ayo and Tunde, shaping their thoughts in ways neither of them could ignore. What had once been accepted without hesitation, the simple truth that they had been abandoned and then found, now felt incomplete, like a story missing its beginning. For Ayo, the questions came gently at first, woven into her work at the clinic. Each time she held the hand of a frightened mother or examined a child whose life depended on decisions made by others, she found herself wondering about her own beginning. Who had carried her? Who had made the choice to leave her behind, and more importantly, why? For Tunde, the questions were sharper, less reflective, more direct. He did not sit with uncertainty easily. He approached it the way he approached everything else, with intention, with focus, and with a need for answers. It was Tunde who first noticed Iyasade. She did not approach them immediately. Instead, she appeared gradually, her presence subtle but consistent. She visited the motor park occasionally, speaking with older workers, asking questions that seemed casual but were carefully chosen. She passed by the kiosk more than once, her eyes lingering just long enough to suggest recognition. One evening, as the sky darkened and the noise of the motor park began to settle, Tunde saw her standing a short distance away, watching. He stood, walked toward her. "You have been coming here," he said, his tone calm but direct. Iyasade did not look surprised. "Yes," she replied. "Why?" She studied him carefully, taking in his posture, his eyes, the quiet authority he carried without effort. "You ask questions," she said. Tunde frowned slightly. "That is not an answer." "No," she agreed, "but it is the beginning of one." He crossed his arms. "Then start properly." Iyasade nodded once. "I knew about the place where you were found," she said. "I knew about it before you ever arrived there." Tunde's expression did not change, but something inside him sharpened. And he asked, "And I know that two children being left there years apart is not coincidence." The words landed with quiet force. Tunde took a step closer. "What are you saying?" Iyasade held his gaze. "I am saying," she replied slowly, "that you were not just abandoned." Tunde's jaw tightened. Then what? She did not answer immediately, because what she was about to say would not simply explain the past. It would challenge everything they believed about it. "You were placed," she said. The distinction was small, but it changed everything. When Tunde brought Iyasade to the kiosk that night, Ayo was already there, reviewing notes from her clinic work. Folake sat nearby, her body resting but her awareness sharp. She noticed immediately that something had shifted. "This is Aya Sade," Tunde said. Ayo looked up, her expression cautious but open. "Good evening," she said politely. Iya Sade nodded. "Good evening." Folake's eyes remained on the woman. She had seen many faces over the years, some kind, some indifferent, some dangerous. This one carried something else. Knowledge. "What do you want?" Folake asked quietly. There was no hostility in her tone, only clarity. Iya Sade respected that. "I want to tell the truth," she said. The air in the kiosk seemed to still. Ayo closed her book slowly. "What truth?" she asked. Aya Sade took a breath. "The truth about how you came into this world, and how you were removed from it." The word lingered. Removed. Ayo felt something cold move through her chest. Tunde remained still, his attention fixed. Folake said nothing, but her silence carried weight. Aya Sade continued. "There was a clinic," she said, "a private one. It handled cases that families did not want known, pregnancies that could not be acknowledged, children that could not be kept." Ayo's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her book. "Why not kept?" she asked. Iya Sade met her eyes. "Because keeping them would have caused problems," she said. "For reputation, for inheritance, for power." The words were not loud, but they were heavy. Tunde spoke next. "And we were part of that," Aya Sade nodded. "Yes." Ayo shook her head slightly. "That does not make sense," she said. "Why leave us on the street? Why not dispose of you completely?" Aya Sade finished gently. Ayo fell silent. Because the thought once spoken could not be undone. "There are different kinds of decisions," Iya Sade said. "Some people cannot bring themselves to destroy life completely, but they can distance themselves from it, remove it from their world, make it someone else's responsibility." Tunde's voice hardened slightly. "So they left us to die?" "No," Iya Sade said quietly. "They left you where someone might find you." The difference again, small, but significant. Folake finally spoke. "And you are sure of this?" Aya Sade turned to her. "I have seen records," she said. "Not complete ones, not official ones, but enough to understand the pattern." Folake's gaze did not waver. "Names?" she asked. Iya Sade hesitated. "Not yet," she admitted, "but I am close." Silence followed, not empty, but full of movement, thoughts, shifting emotions, forming truths beginning to settle into place. Ayo looked down at her hands. For years, she had accepted a simple explanation. Now that explanation had been replaced by something more complex, more unsettling. "They chose this," she said softly. "It was not a question." Tunde exhaled slowly. "Yes." Ayo lifted her gaze again, but Aya Sade's expression softened. "Because you were inconvenient," she said. "Because your existence did not fit into the lives they wanted to maintain. The honesty was difficult, but necessary." Tunde's hands tightened slightly at his sides. "We should find them," he said. Falake's head turned sharply. "No." The word came quickly, firm. Tunde looked at her. "They made a decision," he said. "They should answer for it." Folake held his gaze. "And what will that give you?" "Truth," he replied. Folake shook her head gently. "You already have it." Tunde frowned. "That is not enough." Folake's voice softened, but her words remained steady. "It is enough to know who you are," she said. "Do not let who they were become who you will be." Tunde looked away, because part of him understood, but part of him resisted. Ayo spoke quietly. "I want to know," she said. Both of them turned to her. "Not to hurt them," she added, "but to understand." Aya Sade nodded. "That is why I came," she said. Folake closed her eyes briefly. Because this moment, this turning point, was something she had always known would come. Not the details, not the timing, but the need to understand where they had come from, and the risk that came with it. Because truth did not always heal. Sometimes, it reopened wounds that had already learned how to close. Folake opened her eyes again. "If you continue this," she said slowly, "you must be prepared." For what Ayo asked, Folake looked at both of them. "For the possibility," she said, "that knowing everything will not change how it feels." The words settled deeply, because they were not a warning. They were experience. And as the night grew quieter around them, one thing became clear. The past was no longer something distant. It was moving closer. And soon, it would no longer be something they could choose to ignore. The truth once uncovered did not arrive as a single revelation. It came in fragments, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. Each new piece Yesade brought did not just explain the past. It unsettled the present, shifting how Ayo and Tunde saw themselves and how they understood the life Folake had built for them. But while their attention turned toward what had been hidden, something else, something far more immediate, was quietly slipping beyond their control. Folake was getting worse. It did not happen suddenly. There was no single moment that marked the change. Instead, it revealed itself in small, almost unnoticeable ways, the way she paused longer before standing, the way her breathing became uneven after simple tasks, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. At first, both Ayo and Tunde told themselves it was exhaustion. After all, Folake had lived most of her life carrying burdens that would have broken many others. It made sense that her body would demand rest. But deep down, they both knew this was different. One evening, Ayo arrived back from the clinic earlier than expected. She stepped into the kiosk quietly, expecting to find Folake resting as usual. Instead, she found her sitting on the ground, her back against the wall, her head tilted slightly forward as though she had simply paused in the middle of something. "Auntie," Ayo called softly. No response. Ayo's chest tightened. She moved closer, kneeling quickly. This time Folake's eyes opened slowly. "I am here," she said, her voice faint. Ayo exhaled, sharply, relief and fear mixing at once. "You fainted," she said, her tone shifting from concern to quiet urgency. Folake shook her head slightly. "I only sat down." But Ayo knew better. Her training had taught her to recognize signs the untrained eye might miss. The weakness, the irregular breathing, the pale tone beneath the skin. "We need to take you to the hospital," Ayo said firmly. Folake's expression changed. "No." The word came quickly, decisively. Ayo frowned. "This is not something we can ignore." Folake looked at her, her gaze steady despite her condition. "And what will the hospital do?" she asked. "Ask for money we do not have. Tell us what we already know, that I am tired." Ayo shook her head. "It could be more than that." Folake's voice softened. "It is more than that," she admitted. The room fell silent. Because this was the first time she had not dismissed it. The first time she had acknowledged what they had both begun to suspect. Tunde arrived shortly after. He took one look at Folake and understood immediately. "What happened?" he asked. "She fainted," Ayo replied. Tunde's expression darkened. "We are going to the hospital." Folake shook her head again. "No." Tunde stepped forward. "This is not your decision anymore." Folake looked at him. "And whose decision is it?" "Mine," he said. "And mine," Ayo added. For a moment, the three of them stood in a quiet standoff, each driven by a different kind of fear. Tunde feared losing control. Ayo feared losing time. Folake feared becoming a burden. Finally, Folake spoke again. "If we go," she said, "you must promise me something." Tunde frowned. "What?" "You will not let this change what you are building," she said. "You will not stop your work. You will not sacrifice your future." Tunde shook his head immediately. "That is not promise me," she interrupted gently. Her voice was not loud, but it carried weight. Ayo looked between them, her expression tense. "This is not the time for promises like that," she said. "It is exactly the time," Folake replied. Tunde exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. "Fine," he said. "We promise." Ayo hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Only then did Folake allow herself to be helped to her feet. The hospital confirmed what they had feared. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a calm but serious demeanor, reviewed the tests carefully before speaking. "It has been developing for a long time," he said. Ayo stood beside him, her posture rigid. "What kind of condition?" she asked. The doctor glanced at her. "You are in training?" he asked. Ayo nodded. He exhaled quietly. "Then you understand what prolonged physical strain, poor nutrition, and untreated complications can lead to." Ayo's chest tightened. "Yes." The doctor continued. "Her body has been compensating for years, but it cannot continue at this level." Tunde stepped forward. "What do we do?" The doctor hesitated. Treatment is possible, he said, but it will require consistent care, medication, monitoring, and rest. The last word felt almost ironic. Rest was a luxury Folake had never known. And the cost? Tunde asked. The doctor's silence was enough. That night, the atmosphere in the kiosk changed completely. The questions about the past faded into the background, replaced by something more immediate, more urgent. Time. Or rather, how little of it they might have. Folake lay resting, her breathing steady for now, her face calm in a way that almost hid the reality beneath it. Io sat beside her, her mind racing through possibilities, treatments, options she knew existed but were just out of reach. Tunde stood outside his hands, clenched his thoughts, moving in a different direction. He was not thinking about the illness, not directly. He was thinking about what it required. Money, access, power, the things he had been building toward but had not yet fully reached. When Io joined him outside, she did not speak immediately. They stood in silence, both understanding what the other was thinking. "We need to act quickly," she said finally. Tunde nodded. "I know. I can try to get support through the clinic," she added. "There may be programs. It will not be enough." Tunde interrupted gently. Io looked at him. "Then what do we do?" Tunde's gaze remained fixed ahead. "We stop thinking small." The words were simple, but they carried a shift in perspective. Io studied him. "What does that mean?" Tunde turned slightly. "It means we do whatever is necessary," he said. "Not just what is easy, not just what is available, but what is needed." Io hesitated, because she understood what he was suggesting, and she also understood the risk. "This is not just about money," she said. "It is about time." Tunde nodded. "And we do not have much of that." Inside, Folake opened her eyes. She could hear their voices outside. She did not catch every word, but she understood enough. She had always known this moment might come. Not the illness itself, but the point where the balance would shift, where the children she had raised would face a choice, to hold on to what she had taught them, or to step beyond it. She closed her eyes again, not in fear, not in regret, but in acceptance, because no matter what happened next, she knew one thing for certain. They were no longer the children she had found. They were something more, and whatever path they chose now would define not just their future, but the meaning of everything she had given to them. The plan did not begin as a grand gesture. It began quietly, almost invisibly shaped by urgency rather than spectacle. Tunde understood something clearly now. Time was no longer something they could stretch through endurance alone. If Folake was to receive the care she needed, and if the truth behind their past was ever to be fully confronted, then they would have to step into a space far larger than the one they had always occupied. And so, for the first time, Tunde chose not just to survive within the system, but to engage it. Over the next few weeks, he moved with a level of precision that surprised even those who had come to respect him. He expanded his responsibilities, negotiated aggressively but intelligently, and leveraged every connection he had built over the years. What had once been small operations began to scale, transport contracts increased, partnerships formed, and revenue grew faster than anyone had expected. But he did not speak about his reasons. Not to Alhaji Musa, not to the workers who now followed his instructions without hesitation, and not even fully to Io, because this was not just about money. It was about positioning. At the same time, Io worked in her own way. She reached out to the clinic network, contacted supervisors, and applied for every possible support program she could find. She spoke to doctors, administrators, and organizations that focused on community health care. Some responded with sympathy. A few offered limited assistance, but none could provide the level of sustained care Folake required. Still, she did not stop, because giving up was not something she had learned. Meanwhile, Iyasade continued her investigation. What had once been fragments had now become something far more complete. Names had emerged, connections had formed, and the truth, long buried beneath layers of silence, was finally beginning to surface with clarity. Two families, both influential, both with histories carefully maintained, and both connected to the clinic Iyasade had once worked in. One name stood out first, Chief Bamidele Ogunlai, a respected businessman known for his influence in Lagos's commercial sector. Years ago, his household had quietly dismissed several staff members, including a young domestic worker whose sudden disappearance had never been publicly explained. The second name followed closely, Senator Adeyinka Adebayo, a political figure whose reputation had been carefully protected over decades. Records showed that his daughter had been sent abroad for medical reasons during the same period, returning months later without explanation. No official records of childbirth. No acknowledgement of children. Only silence. But the timing, the locations, and the patterns of removal, all aligned. Iasade knew what it meant. And now she knew something else. This truth could not remain hidden, not if it was to mean anything. When she brought this information to Tunde and Ayo, the air shifted immediately. They sat in the kiosk, the space that had once held their entire world, now feeling too small for what they were about to hear. "These are not rumors," Iasade said calmly. "These are patterns supported by evidence. Not enough for a legal case yet, but enough to understand what happened." Ayo listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tunde remained still, his expression unreadable. "So we were removed," Ayo said slowly, "because we were inconvenient." Iasade nodded. "Yes." Tunde's voice, when it came, was low but steady. "And they continued their lives." "Yes." Ayo closed her eyes briefly. The words did not shock her anymore. But they settled differently now. Not as confusion, but as clarity. Tunde stood up. "What do we do with this?" he asked. Iasade looked at him carefully. "That depends on what you want," she said. "Justice can take many forms." Tunde did not hesitate. "They should be exposed." Ayo looked up at him. And then what she asked. "What does that give us?" Tunde turned to her. "It gives us truth in the open," he said. "Not hidden, not denied." Ayo held his gaze. "And Folake?" she asked quietly. "What does it give her?" The question shifted everything. Because for all the questions about the past, for all the anger and need for accountability, there was one truth that stood above all others. Folake had been the one who stayed. Tunde exhaled slowly. "It gives her what she deserves," he said. Ayo's voice softened. "Then it must be done the right way." The idea of the event came not as revenge but as recognition. Ayo suggested it first. "What if we do not start with them?" she said. "What if we start with her?" Tunde looked at her. "Explain." "We create something public," she continued. "Something that honors community service, care, resilience, everything she represents. We bring people together. We tell her story." Tunde understood immediately. And then he asked. Ayo met his gaze. "And then we reveal the rest." The simplicity of the plan was what made it powerful. Not confrontation, not accusation, but truth, placed in the open, where it could not be ignored. Over the following weeks, the plan took shape. Tunde used his growing influence to organize a citywide event under the banner of community recognition. It was positioned as a gathering to celebrate individuals who had contributed to society in quiet but meaningful ways, people often overlooked but essential. The idea gained attention quickly. Sponsors came forward. Media outlets expressed interest, and eventually invitations were extended to figures of influence, including Chief Ogunlai and Senator Adebayo. Neither suspected anything beyond what appeared to be a standard public relations event. Meanwhile, Ayo ensured that Folake remained unaware of the full scale of what was being prepared. "She will not agree if she knows," Ayo said. Tunde nodded. "She does not need to agree," he replied. "She only needs to be present." As the day approached, tension built quietly beneath the surface, not visible to the public, but deeply felt by those who knew what was coming. The night before the event, Ayo sat beside Folake, who rested more often now, her strength continuing to decline despite their efforts to stabilize her condition. "There is something happening tomorrow," Ayo said gently. Folake looked at her. "What kind of something?" "A gathering," Ayo replied. "They want to recognize people who have helped others." Folake smiled faintly. "Then why are you telling me?" "Because you are coming," Ayo said. Folake frowned slightly. "No." Ayo reached for her hand. "Yes." Folake shook her head. "I am not part of such things." Ayo's voice softened. "You are." The words lingered, not as persuasion, but as truth. Folake looked at her daughter, at the young woman she had raised, who now carried herself with quiet certainty. "And what will I do there?" she asked. Io smiled gently. "You will stand," she said, "and let the world see you." The next morning, Lagos moved as it always did, busy, loud, indifferent to individual moments. But within one part of the city, something different was about to unfold. The venue was prepared. The guests arrived. The atmosphere carried a sense of importance, though no one yet understood why. And as Folake was guided quietly into the space, unaware of what was waiting, something began to shift, not just for her, but for everyone who would soon witness what had been hidden for far too long. Because this was no longer just about survival. It was about recognition, about truth, and about a moment that would not only reveal the past, but redefine it. The hall was already full by the time Folake arrived. It was larger than any space she had ever stepped into, not just in size, but in presence. The polished floors reflected light from above, and rows of neatly arranged chairs stretched across the room, occupied by people dressed in fabrics far finer than anything she had ever owned. Conversations filled the air in low, confident tones, the kind that belonged to people accustomed to being heard. Folake paused at the entrance. For a moment she hesitated. This was not her world. She could feel it immediately, not through rejection, but through difference. The way people stood, the way they carried themselves, the way they spoke, it all belonged to a life she had never lived. "Io," she said quietly. Io stepped closer, her hand gently supporting Folake's arm. "It's okay," she said. "You're not alone." Tunde stood on her other side, his presence steady, grounded. "Just walk with us," he added. Folake nodded slowly. And so she stepped forward. At first, no one noticed her. The event had already begun. Speeches about community impact, recognition of individuals who had contributed to society in visible ways. Applause rose and fell, names were called, and people walked onto the stage to receive acknowledgement for their work. Folake listened, her expression calm, though she did not fully understand why she had been brought there. Then something changed. The host paused. There was a shift in tone, subtle but unmistakable. "And now," the host said, "we would like to recognize someone whose impact has never been recorded, whose work has never been formally acknowledged, but whose life has shaped more than any title could ever capture." A quiet murmur spread through the audience. "This is a story," the host continued, "not of wealth, not of power, but of choice. A choice made when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose." Io's hand tightened slightly around Folake's arm. Tunde's gaze remained fixed ahead. "Many years ago," the host said, "2 children were found abandoned on the streets of this city, left without protection, without identity, without a future that anyone could see." The room grew still. Folake's breath slowed. Something inside her began to stir. "They could have been ignored," the host continued. "They could have become another story lost in the noise of survival. But one woman made a different choice. A pause, long enough for the weight of the words to settle. She took them in. She raised them. She fed them when she had nothing. She protected them when the world turned away." Folake's hand trembled slightly. She understood now. Not everything, but enough. "And today," the host said softly, "those 2 children stand among us, not as victims of their beginning, but as proof of what love, when chosen without condition, can create." Io stepped forward. Tunde followed. The audience turned, watching, waiting, and then they knelt, right there in the center of the hall, before Folake. The sound that followed was not immediate applause. It was silence, a deep collective silence that held more emotion than any reaction could have. Ayo's voice, when it came, was steady but filled with feeling. "You gave us a life we were never meant to have," she said. Tunde lowered his head slightly. "You chose us when no one else did." Folake stood frozen. Her eyes moved between them, her mind struggling to catch up with the moment unfolding around her. "I did what anyone would do," she said softly. But even as the words left her, she knew they were not true, because not everyone had done what she did, not even close. Io shook her head gently. "No," she said. "You did what only you chose to do." The audience remained silent, listening, witnessing. Tunde looked up. "For years," he said, "we believed we were abandoned without reason, that we were simply left." A shift in tone, subtle but significant. But that was not the truth. A ripple moved through the room. because now something deeper was beginning. There were decisions made, Tunde continued, by people who had power, by people who chose reputation over responsibility. At the back of the hall, two figures sat still. Chief Ogunlai, Senator Adebayo. Their expressions did not change, but the air around them did. Iyasade stepped forward from the side, her presence calm, her voice clear. For years, she said these stories were hidden, protected by silence. But silence does not erase truth. The room held its breath. These children were not accidents, she continued. They were removed, left where they might be found but not claimed. Ayo's voice followed. We are not here for revenge, she said. We are here for truth, Tunde added quietly, and for recognition of the person who gave us everything, without asking for anything in return. The focus returned to Folake. Fully, completely. The weight of the moment settled around her not as pressure but as something overwhelming in a different way. Recognition. Not of her struggle, but of her choice, her life, her impact. The audience began to respond not with loud applause at first, but with something softer. Tears. Some people wiped their eyes quietly. Others looked down as if reflecting on something they had never considered before. Then slowly the sound of clapping began. It grew. Not forced, not polite, but genuine. Standing ovations followed. People rose to their feet not because they were expected to, but because they felt compelled to. Folake remained still. Her eyes filled, though she did not immediately let the tears fall. She looked at Ayo, at Tunde, at the people before her, and for the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a poor woman, not as someone struggling to survive, but as someone whose life had meaning, whose choices had mattered. Deeply, Ayo stood and gently took her hand. Come, she said softly. Folake hesitated, then allowed herself to be guided forward. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause continued. But she did not focus on the crowd. She focused on the two people beside her, the children she had found, the lives she had chosen. And in that moment, something inside her settled. Not because everything had been resolved, not because the past had been undone, but because what she had given had become something real, something visible, something undeniable. And as she stood there, supported by the very people she had once carried, Folake understood something clearly. That love, even when given in the smallest place with the least resources, could grow into something powerful enough to move an entire city. Some stories are not about miracles. They are about choices, quiet, unseen choices made in moments when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose. Folake's story reminds us that true impact is not measured by wealth or recognition, but by the lives we choose to lift when it is hardest to do so. She had no power, no resources, no guarantee of success, but she had something far greater, a heart that refused to turn away. And in the end, that was enough to change everything. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. What small act of kindness could you choose today that might change someone's life tomorrow? Tell us where you're watching from, and what part of this story stayed with you the most. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more stories that remind us what it truly means to be human.